So if you're watching this video, then you probably already know about the more notable games in the TurboGrafx-16's library. Your Bonks, your Bloody Wolves, and your Splatterhouses. And everybody pretty much agrees that those games are amazing. But the Turbo is no stranger to underrated, sort of dark horse games that people often shrug off because they're not in that upper echelon, which I think is kind of unfair to the game and to ourselves, because that really just limits our own experiences for no real reason. So today, I want to go over a few Turbo games that I feel like have either been more harshly judged or just kind of ignored more than they should have been. And maybe I'll change a few minds in the process. Expectations of any pack-in game are generally high. These games are usually the first ones people play on their shiny new consoles, so the burden of showing off what the system can do while also being a representative of the library as a whole is kind of an unfair one, but it is a burden those games carry nonetheless. And in NEC's infinite wisdom, the TurboGrafx-16's pack-in game, the one that would set the tone for Turbo owners across North America, would not be Legendary Axe, Superstar Soldier, or even Bonk's Adventure. Now, those games would make too much sense. Turbo owners would be introduced to the library by Keith Courage in Alpha Zones, as if anybody knew who Keith Courage was, or cared why he was in Alpha Zones. They did release a little comic to sell the idea of his character and the story about underground aliens trying to take over the world from within, which is kind of interesting. But because of that choice, many Turbo owners would start out their journeys a little bit underwhelmed, even though Keith Courage isn't actually a bad game. Keith Courage is a completely decent, if not, dare I say, good game for the Turbo, with more than a few things going for it. The platforming is simple but solid, especially in the overworld stages that have a laid-back, kind of cutesy vibe to them that undersells their challenge. While the first and second overworld stages are pretty easy, they manage to ratchet up the challenge soon afterwards, as the platforming demands more precision and the enemies are more densely packed in. The graphics here are a little bit flat, but still bring plenty of vivid colors and fun character designs to the fore, and do give the player at least a small glimpse of what the system would be capable of. As simple as these stages are, they do have a lot of personality to them, and they're easy on the eyes. The music in the overworld fits the visuals perfectly, and I rather like it. It really creates a quirky vibe, and makes the game feel a little bit more unique. As you're hopping around these levels, you'll also talk to characters in little huts who want to sell you stuff, like Nurse Nancy, who heals you, Weapon Master, who sells you swords and other wares, and Wise Wizard. Not a wise wizard, mind you, but apparently the wise wizard who sells you bombs, while looking like what I'm pretty sure God looks like, and this guy who's just kind of there. Keith also has to fight off random little enemies all the time here, which never pose too much of a challenge on their own, but can get overwhelming in later stages if you don't stay on top of them. They can also complicate the more difficult platforming sections dramatically. Thankfully, the controls are tight and responsive, so you can maneuver around them pretty well. These enemies can easily be farmed for extra coins, which I highly recommend doing so you can upgrade your sword faster and stay stocked up on bombs, all of which you're definitely going to need when you put on that Nova suit and go to the underworld. Down here, enemies are much faster, and many of them take multiple hits and have more complex attacks. The platforming is much more precarious down here too. Keith's Nova suit looks pretty badass, but it doesn't really do a whole lot outside of that. You're still basically just jumping around and slashing enemies with your sword, albeit a way cooler sword that gets longer with each upgrade from the Weapons Master, although I'm not sure if it's actually getting stronger, since each underworld level seems to have stronger enemies anyway. Having a longer sword is definitely useful though. Now, sometimes I'd say the level layouts here teeter into being a little bit unfair, since you can only see so far down, making it hard to tell where you're supposed to drop down and where doing so will kill Keith Courage. So the occasional misplaced leap of faith is definitely going to happen, and that's annoying. Firing off the bombs by pressing the attack button and the up button on the D-pad is also a little bit awkward, and would kind of unintentionally highlight one of the Turbo's key issues, the fact that the controller only had two main buttons, like an 8-bit system, despite the library having more 16-bit style games that tend to play better with 3 or 4 buttons. And yeah, you could buy 3-button controllers and 6-button controllers down the road, but again, this is the pack-in game, so it's just another thing that points to Keith Courage being a bad choice for that. Anyway, the underworld stages are increasingly complicated to navigate with dead ends and far more verticality than the more traditional overworld ones, so be prepared to do a little bit of exploring to find the end. I wouldn't call them overly complicated though, and you'll eventually find your way through. The music in these stages is also totally different and sounds much more like some of the higher-end soundtracks that you'll find in better Turbo games, with deep bass lines, stereo separation, and catchy melodies. That said, after a few minutes, these underworld tunes can start to feel kind of repetitive. Alright, I get it. Eventually you'll reach the bottom of these stages and go up against the boss. All of these bosses are rather cool looking and can be fun to fight for a little bit, though I gotta admit their novelty wears off pretty fast. Once you figure out their movement patterns, which usually takes about 15 seconds or so, it becomes pretty obvious where you're supposed to squeeze in hits. And so you'll just do that until they're dead. They don't really seem to change much throughout the fight, so they're just kinda there. Again, I like them, but they just needed a little bit more of something to make them really stand out. Ah well, once they're dealt with, you'll be royal rainbowed off Katamari style to the next overworld level and the process begins again. It's not a particularly inventive game loop and doesn't really evolve into much more than this, but as the underworld levels get longer and more difficult, and the overworld stages do the same, it does provide some meaningful challenge, and even a few unexpected twists, like icy floors and previous bosses showing up as regular enemies for a little bit of revenge. The underworld stages in particular do get rather tough, and can even start to feel prohibitive if you're not really putting in work to master the enemy movements and keeping your sword upgraded. You will hit a brick wall if you neglect any of that. All of this can make Keith Courage feel like it favors difficulty and repetition over variety and creativity at a certain point, which is not an uncommon thing for games from this era. It's just something that stands out more, I think, because it's a pack-in game. So, is Keith Courage an all-time classic? No. Does it fall short in several areas? Absolutely. But I like it. It's sort of the epitome of a solid 6 or maybe a soft 7 out of 10. It's not quite what I would call a great game, but it's way better than a lot of the lower-end stuff of its time. It's fine for what it is. And had it just been released as a regular game and not a pack-in, and saddled with all the baggage that comes with, I suspect a lot more people would look back on it in a kinder light. It absolutely gets trounced by Legendary Axe and other games on the Turbo that do everything this game does much better. But it also manages to be a completely recommendable, decent little action platformer game that's easy to pick up and enjoy for at least a little while. Vigilante, I think, is overlooked and underrated mostly because of the time in which it hit the scene, 1998, with the TurboGrafx version coming out a whole year later. The beat-em-up genre was alive and well at this time, but it was also on the cusp of a major revolution that would be ushered in by games like Streets of Rage and Final Fight, with their expanded movesets, special attacks, and more 3D-style movement. And once that page turned, these simpler sort of beat-em-ups from the past would get left in the dust, which I think I'm ultimately fine with, since I adore games like Streets of Rage, and I do ultimately prefer that 90s style of beat-em-up over these 80s style ones, I guess. But that doesn't mean there isn't enjoyment to find in these older style beat-em-ups like Ninja Warrior, and yes, Vigilante. Vigilante has no special screen-clearing moves, no moving up or down, no alternate characters, and no grabs. Well, unless you count when enemies grab and start choking the life out of you. It doesn't even have a particularly unique story, as you play the Vigilante taking on an army of punks, goons, and hooligans to rescue the same interchangeable damsel in distress that you're always saving in these games. Vigilante does have weapons though. Well, one weapon, the nunchuck thing, which is a godsend if you can hang on to it. If the Vigilante drops it from taking damage, it's gone for good, and you're back to fists and feet until you can find another. So hang on to it as long as possible, since they give you an increase in reach and damage with virtually no downside. Unlike a lot of the games I'm covering here, Vigilante doesn't really have a bad reputation that I'm trying to combat, but I do see it being shrugged off as generic and forgettable more often than I'd like. Now, despite its obvious limitations, Vigilante does a pretty good job of staying fun and engaging with distinct levels that each have their own look, their own feel, and their own set of challenges. You'll go from fending off dudes who are jumping down on you from stacks of wrecked cars in the junkyard, to jump-kicking punks off their motorcycles in a rather cool-looking bridge stage, dodging dynamite-throwing psychopaths here, and a couple more things that keep the game fun and pretty amusing the whole way through. The music is also outstanding, which would be common of Irem games on the Turbo. Like with Ninja Spirit and Legend of Hero Tonma and Image Fight, Irem would push the high end of the Turbo sound chip pretty hard with some sharp-sounding melodies, giving Vigilante a unique sound that I rather enjoy. When you combine it with the visuals, you almost get the sense that they're going for maybe a little bit of a West Side Story vibe. I'm a fan of this track in particular. So maybe not the best soundtrack on the system, but it's definitely a good one and one of the more interesting ones for sure. Punching with button 1, kicking with button 2, and jumping with the up button is generally a better control scheme for a fighting game than a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but somehow it manages to work okay here. Maybe because of how simple the game is, and the fact that you rarely have to actually jump anyway, Vigilante just kinda gets away with it. While the meat of the levels usually contains endless swarms of enemies mindlessly running at you, something about the kinetic feel of the combat keeps it fun, at least to me. The blunt sound effects when you land a hit on an enemy accompanied by their unconscious bodies just falling off the screen, I don't know, it just gives you a constant slow drip of dopamine that never really gets old. The only place where Vigilante does fall a little bit short in my view is the boss fights. There's not a whole lot to them other than the one or sometimes two attacks that they have, and their giant health bars mean that the fights tend to linger and overstay their welcome. The hit detection on them also isn't great, leading to at least a couple of cheap hits and annoying moments in almost every boss fight. Except the first guy though, you can just kinda pin him up against the back of the truck and go to town on his face until he drops. Which is kind of the opposite problem, I guess. So despite the somewhat wonky control layout, and some other quirks like the questionable hit detection, overall I like the way Vigilante controls just fine. It's got its own feel to it. Vigilante is surprisingly bright and colorful for the style of game that it is. It's not going to blow your mind with insane amounts of detail or anything, but it's a good-looking game. I like it. This level in particular looks really nice, I think. Just a great level overall here, kicking dudes off their exploding motorcycles while New York City scrolls in the background. Vigilante was never going to be a system seller, but it nails the fundamentals well enough to be a good game. As I've pointed out before, I'm extremely picky with puzzle games. I like challenge, but I don't like being stuck. Some of the Turbo's other puzzle games like Tricky Kick and Time Ball are kryptonite to me for that very reason. Boxy Boy, however, brought to us by Media Rings and Thinking Rabbit, has a nice balance of presenting me with the ingredients I need to find a solution while also forcing me to think outside the box to do so. The concept of getting the boxes to the yellow dots couldn't be simpler, but even from the first couple of levels, it's very clear that the path to doing this is littered with brain-teasing limitations. For instance, you can only push boxes, you can't pull them, so once a box is pushed into a corner, it's stuck there. You also cannot push two boxes at once. Now the game does give you a rewind mechanic that lets you undo your mistakes, and a sprint button to speed things up when you're running back and forth in some of the larger levels, which is smart. I ain't got all day. So between all of this, you can figure it out. You just really need to turn your brain on. Boxy Boy's graphics aren't what I would call impressive, but they are pleasant, and the color palettes change up every 20 levels or so to designate the game's 5 different worlds, which doesn't always mean levels are going to be bigger or even more difficult, but it often does. But generally, I enjoy figuring them out, although I'm not too sure what I think about this one. There seems to be usually only 1 or 2 actual strategies to solve them though, so some of them will take some serious time to unravel if they don't click with your brain right away, which is something they almost never do with me. Figuring out which boxes to move first and which to ignore until later is the key, and sometimes you'll be very deep into what you think is the solution before you realize it's not. And that's where the rewind function or even the restart option in the pause menu comes in handy. You can even put in several passwords to unlock large swaths of levels, and just float around the game at your own pace, which I think is a fun way to enjoy it. If you ever get stuck or bored of one stage, you have a buttload of others to try out. On top of all that content, and the dangerously catchy music and satisfying nature of the puzzle solving, I think Boxy Boy is a must-own if you dig puzzle games, or even if you're just open to them. Gotta include a shmup, and since most shmups on the Turbo are generally praised or ignored as much as they should be, one of the few that I feel is actually underrated is Galaga 90. Despite what a lot of people seem to think, this is not just a shinier port of Galaga. I mean, it is that, but it's also a lot more. This is by any measure a step forward for the series, with several improvements and new ideas that make it feel more like a real sequel than just another version of the same game, even though the name sort of does a bad job of communicating that. The drastically improved graphics and sound give Galaga 90's levels and enemies way more personality than in the original version. Enemies still behave like they always did. They assemble into formation and attack you in waves, which you do your best to deal with by either shooting them down or avoiding them. Although it is rather simple and feels maybe a little bit out of place on a 16-bit system, it is a fun formula that holds up and sets the game apart from other shmups on the Turbo. The art style of the original game is definitely intact, just with a better variety of color and more detail. Like what you would expect from a 16-bit system, the graphics don't push the Turbo to its limits, but they do feel like a logical step forward from the original game, and I think that's the point. The audio is also a much richer set of music and sounds, designed by Namco veteran Hiroyuki Kawada, who also worked on the music for Yokai, Dochuki, and Valkyrie no Densetsu, which are excellent PC Engine games that didn't make it over to the Turbo, and hopefully I get to cover those at some point. But take it from me, that's quite a pedigree when it comes to sound design. Here you can combine ships to create a dual or triple fighter, which essentially just adds to your firepower, at the cost of making you a bigger target. Enemies can combine with each other too, giving them the same effect. Given the inherent simplicity of Galaga, I think this mechanic is much needed and largely feels like a net positive since it adds a little bit of spice to the game if you want it, but can just as easily be ignored if you don't. Much like the Turbo functionality, which will make you a more formidable threat if you want, or you can keep that off to retain that arcade challenge. You can also grab these blue capsules to warp across broad swaths of the game, making it less of a linear experience than most shmups tend to be. You're still locked to only moving left or right, which will definitely feel limiting when you compare it to something like Superstar Soldier or literally any other shmup on the system, but it's also definitely a part of Galaga's DNA, so I'm not sure if I consider it a flaw or not, but I do understand if it feels like an unnecessary limitation to the average player, especially considering that, by this time, we already had a ton of top-down shooters with way more flexible gameplay and variety baked into them. So, in that way, I can totally see why Galaga 90 isn't ever really talked about, much less praised. But I do think it pushes what a Galaga game can be about as far as it can before it stops being Galaga, which, in my book, is a respectable endeavor. If you enjoy Galaga or other classic shooters from the Bronze Age of gaming, I'd say this is an easy recommendation, and certainly an underrated game in general. Alright, here's one that I'm fairly certain I'm gonna get a lot of pushback on, but I'm fine with that. Come at me. I have decades of experience playing this game at this point, and while I do think the difficulty curve is probably steeper than it needs to be, Power Golf is a fun and surprisingly rewarding golf game on the Turbo that I highly recommend if you're into the genre. I've always liked golf personally, and though I'm no expert at it, I've enjoyed most golf games that I've played to one extent or another. I'll admit I'm generally partial to the more forgiving, arcadey-style golf games, but when I am in the mood for a more demanding version of that sort of thing, Power Golf on the TurboGrafx is usually my go-to. The gameplay is pretty standard. If you've ever played a golf game before, you'll see a lot of familiar things to keep in mind, like wind speed, choosing the right club for the distance you're trying to cover, avoiding sand traps, trees, and bodies of water, and a meter that requires precise timing on your part to hit the ball with the force and angle you want. You also have various slopes on the green to account for when putting, so Power Golf has most of the key elements that you would probably expect from a golf game today. Where the game trips a lot of people up, I think, is just in its general difficulty, and that shows up in a few key areas, like the absolute pinpoint precision that's often required when hitting the ball. Even being slightly off when determining your curve can send the ball sailing wildly off course. Even though I consider myself pretty decent at the game, I'm no stranger to losing a couple of strokes to small errors. That said, with some persistence, this difficulty can be mitigated significantly. You should also choose your character wisely, as the old man generally drives balls further, while the woman character has more leeway in her accuracy, and the young man is kind of a balance between the two. Determining which one fits your playstyle best is super important, and generally involves determining how much sensitivity you're willing to deal with. The choice is yours, but don't blame the game when you choose the old man and wind up 40 strokes over par. The wrong club, forgetting to account for the wind, or screwing up the timing of your shot will all sink your game on their own, let alone together. Everything has to be right. And this might make Power Golf feel like the Dark Souls of golf games in a way, but like the Souls games, it also sets you up for immense satisfaction when you do manage to put it all together and come in under par. Power Golf also supports up to 3 players with multiple modes, so you can really get your money's worth with this one if you want. You can check the scoreboard at any time and survey the course before your turn starts, which are both nice features. It also helps a lot that Hudson Soft graced this game with yet another way above average soundtrack that keeps you humming along despite how bad you may or may not be doing. I also like how the music totally cuts out when you're putting to give those moments an extra dose of tension. I don't recommend Power Golf to everyone, as it is rather unforgiving, and with so many more approachable golf games out there these days, it's kind of a tough sell to the average player. But I do think it's unfairly judged as a bad game far too often by far too many people. Power Golf never was, and never will be, anybody's favorite golf game, but the idea that it's a bad one has just never made any sense to me, although I think it's fair to say it's an acquired taste. But if you like golf games and don't mind ones with a little bit of an edge to them, I think Power Golf is at least worth a try. As you can see, there's plenty of TurboGrafx games that have plenty going for them, despite not being on anybody's top 10 lists. So maybe I've been able to convince you to give a couple of these games a second chance, maybe not. But I really do feel like you're not getting the most out of this library if you're only playing the heavy hitters that everybody agrees on. So maybe give a few of them a try and let me know what you think. But also let me know what are some other underrated TurboGrafx games that maybe I should have brought up here. I know there's at least a few more that would certainly qualify, and I should probably do a follow-up to this video anyway, so maybe I'll include them in that. And also feel free to let me know if you think all of my picks are trash and I'm an idiot, but just explain why. Don't just say I'm an idiot. Explain why I'm an idiot. That's what I want to know. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.